Thank you all for being here today. I'm Bill McBride, the Executive Director of the National Governors Association, or otherwise known as NGA. And we're pleased to partner with the Environmental Council of the States, ECOS, on this event, and we appreciate all of you being here. And thank you to the Congressional staff, administration representatives, and partners for joining us for this briefing. Everyone here agrees that a strong water infrastructure system and access to clean and safe drinking water is essential to state and local communities, and at the national level, it's essential to supporting economic growth and global competitiveness. I want you to know that governors are committed partners in ensuring strong water infrastructure, from maintaining ports to administrating the long, successful clean water and drinking water state revolving fund programs. Now, our goal today is to leave with you a clearer picture of the situation on the ground in states and territories as governors and other state leaders implement federal policies, to highlight what's going right and to identify areas where we can all work together to improve policy so states and territories have the resources and authority they need to achieve our shared goals. And with this morning's announcements on PFAS regulations, which I understand is happening as we speak, and with the FY25 appropriation season getting underway, we have a number of very timely topics lined up. I look forward to a productive conversation today with all of you. And thank you, and I'd now like to turn to Ben Grumbles, the Executive Director at ECOS.
Thanks, Bill. Good morning, everybody. I'm Ben Grumbles, Executive Director of ECOS. ECOS is the Environmental Council of the States. That's the national, nonprofit, nonpartisan association of the top appointed environmental officials for all of the states, the District of Columbia, and the territories. And I see Puerto Rico in the room. Thank you so much for being here. We have some all-stars, part of our panel discussion, who are going to touch on the priorities, not just of NGA, but also ECOS. And I also want to remind everyone that, particularly for your friends and colleagues who are not able to be here in person, through the generosity of NGA, this session is being recorded, and it will be available very soon, maybe later today. We'll see. But and I also want to encourage everyone to take a packet of information, ECOS folders and NGA folders for the sessions, for the activities that we're focusing on today. And with that, let me also say we're right on course, and that means I get to turn the ball over to Jordan Marsh, South Carolina.
Well, thank you so much for that, and appreciate the opportunity to be here today. Thanks to the Congressional staff, the NGA partners, my counterparts in other governor's offices. My name is Jordan Marsh. I'm Governor McMaster's Director of Federal Affairs based here in Washington. I'm here today on behalf of the National Governors Association, which is the voice of governors in Washington, D.C., representing all 55 states and territories. My boss, Governor McMaster, co-chairs the National Governors Association Economic Development and Revitalization Task Force with Governor Andy Beshear of Kentucky. Coulter Minix, his D.C. representative, couldn't be here today, so we now have my colleague, Jim McCluskey from right up north in North Carolina. So appreciate you being here today, Jim. At the NGA, we develop policy priorities to advocate to Congress. As you know, in Congress, it's difficult to find consensus. With 55 governors across the states, we do the same thing, but we're able to come to a compromise and put forward our policy priorities for our task force. And just to give you some background, our task force focuses on national economic development in the lens of infrastructure, energy, environment, broadband, land management, and technology. In our most recently adopted bipartisan priorities in terms of water infrastructure, we focused on safeguarding water resources by protecting the Clean Water and Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, prioritizing the needs of states and territories through water reauthorization, and a timely manner addressing threats of forever chemicals like PFAS. Given that I've got two representatives of North Carolina on my panel today, I do have to give a little bit of context about South Carolina and the environmental, the beautiful coast and mountains. So South Carolina is obviously blessed with a unique landscape from the mountains to the coastlines. I'm sure people have been to either Charleston or Myrtle Beach. My boss, Governor McMaster, believes in conservation and preservation of the environment, but he also believes in symbiotic relationship between that and economic development. So we don't find them as competing, but how do they work together? In South Carolina, Environmental Foundation is our health and is the state's health and prosperity. Clean air, safe drinking water, well-managed land and waste are all essential to healthy communities, a thriving economy, and a healthy life for all South Carolinians. Just to give you some context, I know we're here talking about water infrastructure in South Carolina. We appreciate Congress providing the American Rescue Plan. We use $1.5 billion of the American Rescue Plan to improve water and sewer infrastructure in our local governments and local municipalities. $1.5 billion is an incredible investment, transformational. However, the unmet need remains, especially with the consideration of addressing new PFAS concerns. And last but not least, as it relates to South Carolina, go Lady Gamecocks, national championship winners. And NC State was close, but not there. For our priorities, I want to start with the underscore the state revolving fund and be very clear that the NGA is not against congressionally directed spending. However, we do have concerns about the recent practice of water infrastructure congressionally directed spending out of the state revolving fund accounts, thereby significantly reducing the amount that is left to allocate to states and territories through capitalization grants. This practice has in fact cut funding at all levels for every single state and territory. I'll let my colleagues share more details who are the issue matter experts there. On to the Water Resource Development Act. Our main priority here is to support the reauthorization. The NGA supports continued efforts to ensure the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund and Inland Waterway Trust Fund recipients are equitably allocated and dedicated for their intended purposes and ensure our ports and inland waterways are maintained at the highest level. We also support robust funding for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Civil Works programs for flood control and ecosystem restoration. Finally, addressing PFAS, like I said, timely manner today. I'll let my colleagues speak more to that. I believe you were on a podcast recently talking about the implications of the new PFAS rule, so you seem better suited to talk about the topic. With that said, I'll turn it over to my colleague in North Carolina, Jim McCleskey.
Good morning. Thanks for having us, and thanks for joining us. I do represent the state of North Carolina through our Washington, D.C. office. I could ask how many of you new states have D.C. offices, but we do, and we're here to try to make federalism work, and we really appreciate your public service in that effort. I'm eyes, ears, sometimes hands and fingers, but my brain lives in Raleigh. I'm going to defer mostly to Secretary Beiser on getting into substance here for a minute, but I want to touch on a couple things that Jordan mentioned. I started on the Hill way back in the 80s when there used to be these things called conference committees. And the first meeting I went to as a young staffer for Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan was a conference committee on the SRFs and the Clean Water Act reauthorization. And all the substance was done and it was down to the money. The fundamental message we're here to deliver on SRFs, we are the S, and we're asking you to keep the R and the F in it. The revolving nature of these funds is undercut by money off the top that goes directly out as grants and doesn't come back to the program as a revolve, to make it revolve. Right now, and our delegation has gone to bat, a subset of them, but a number of them, and succeeded in securing directed funding. But because the rules are set by the subcommittee at this time where money comes off the front instead of earmarks being additive as they were in the earlier part of this century, before they were suspended for a while. Right now, the newest numbers we've got, and these are in your packages, is that 47 states and all the territories are actually doing worse. So a very small, less than a handful of states are doing better with directed funding. The other effect this can have and does have in North Carolina is that we do have statutorily set prioritization for funds going to areas of most need, communities of most need. In general, and this is not to take anything away from my friends in the advocacy community, but in general, communities that can afford to hire a lobbyist to come get an earmark aren't at the top of that needs list. And that's something worth keeping in mind. That said, there is a pretty simple solution to at least part of the program problem, which would be to make these funds additive again. It would still, the revolving nature of that would still be an issue. We also, the states, have to run these programs, and administrative funds are available to the states through the SRF that are undercut by the use of direct spending, which doesn't bring with it that benefit. So we need your help to change the rules so that, frankly, the Congress can have its cake and eat it too, and we can meet the demand that we've got. We're a high growth state, but we have a lot of small and rural systems that really need help. Our legislators are stepping up on this, separate and apart from federal funds, but we need more, and we need SRF to be viable going forward. I will stop with that and hand off to my secretary, Elizabeth Beiser, who herself has long experience in this space and other spaces. She's the president of ECOS this year, and we're glad to have her in national service.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you all for being here. On behalf of our ECOS members, a number of which are up here also, we are happy to have Texas and New Mexico and the District of Columbia represented here as well today. So as we get to the conversation portion, I'm looking forward to having input from everyone. There's a little thing happening in North Carolina this morning. I believe my predecessor and I have just switched. He is in North Carolina making the announcement on the finalization of the drinking water standards for 6 PFAS compounds, and I get to be up here with you all, which I'm very happy to be. This is, PFAS is an issue that is top of mind. I know Jordan mentioned it. I think there's probably not a person in this room who hasn't given some thought to PFAS in the past few years. One of the significant pieces of today's announcement is that now starts a clock for us as we are helping our water systems in our states to come into compliance with the new standards. I know in North Carolina we had a lot of early experience. We have a facility that is a former DuPont facility called Chemours in the Fayetteville region, which is actually Fayetteville is where the administrator is as we speak, that caused contamination over at least an 8-county region. That is not the only place that North Carolina has PFAS contamination. And I know we had early experience, but states across the country are having to spend a lot of dollars to look at assessments to figure out not only which water systems have issues, but also where are those issues coming from? What is the source of the PFAS contamination that is leading them to have to look at treatment options for their drinking water systems? In North Carolina, I can just speak to our experience having tested most of our systems. We're looking at about 18% of our systems not meeting the MCL. That's going to require a significant dollar amount investment, not only to install treatment technology, but also for the ongoing operation and maintenance of these systems going forward. We are, of course, wanting to ensure that all of our residents have access to clean drinking water, and are dedicated to seeing this process through. But as we're talking about items such as the SRFs, having congressionally directed spending coming out of the corpus of those funding, we're really concerned about making sure that we have ongoing support for states as we're tackling not only an aging water infrastructure, but also the new challenges that are emerging from emerging contaminants, but which, by the way, are not so emerging. They've been around since the 1940s, where this is not necessarily a new issue, but it's a new issue that we're having to deal with to ensure that we've got water that meets these standards. Also wanted to mention, we are also focused on the circular economy. So as we're thinking about waste, I know landfill capacity, as we think about infrastructure, is another area of concern for a lot of states, making sure that we've got affordable disposal options. We are looking at how can we advance the conversation at a national level about moving away from a make-take waste society to a more circular economy. We're reviewing end-of-life materials as manufacturing feedstock that can create jobs, economic investment, can also ensure that we are not taking virgin materials from the environment, better from an environmental standpoint, and also helps address equity issues. So we certainly have been working on that, specifically looking at items of new emerging waste streams, including from renewable energy, from batteries, but really looking across the spectrum, including items like food waste that make up a quarter of the waste stream, but have significantly underfunded infrastructure systems. So I'm going to next hand it to my colleague, Jess Byrne, who's the director of the Idaho Department of Environmental Quality, to talk about a few other ECOS priorities.
All right, great. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. And as mentioned, my name is Jess Byrne, and I'm the director of the Idaho Department of Environmental Quality. And really appreciate the opportunity to be here and give a little bit of state perspective. By way of background, I've been in this role for just under 4 years, but I was the deputy director for a little over 8 years prior to that, and I've been with the department for a total of 25 years. So through that time, I've had a lot of opportunity to observe how the department has evolved over that time, and a lot of the issues that I've observed kind of relate to capacity within the department. So I'd say as an agency, we reached a peak capacity probably in about the 2008 timeframe. Imagine that, close to the Great Recession. and took a big dip in capacity and have been trying to rebuild ever since. So focus of my comments this morning are just in general wanting to talk about federal funding, not just for the more attractive issues of PFAS and SRF, but the categorical grants that are provided to states to run really our core environmental programs. So think of the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Safe Drinking Water Act, and the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. And there's two main points that I really want to leave the group with this morning. And the first being that states are the primary implementers of our nation's environmental laws. So this is stuff that occurs within each individual state, and it's state employees that generally implement these. For example, 50 states have authorization for the Clean Air Act programs. 49 have similar primacy for the Safe Drinking Water Act. 48 have primacy for the Resource Conservation Recovery Act, and 47 for the NPDES program under the Clean Water Act. So in my time at DEQ, I would argue that we never have enough resources to fully do the job that we're asked to do. However, today I really want to focus on the fact that the gap between what most states need as far as implementing environmental programs and what we actually have just continues to widen. And so we're hoping that we can focus on that and start to address those challenges. The main reason for that gap, in my opinion, is that for the past 20 years, federal funding for those categorical grants has either been flat or decreasing, and so inflation has really been eating up a lot of that funding. And this reduction in capacity that results in is important for a lot of reasons, but more germane to this group is the fact that a lot of the programs that, particularly our core programs that state environmental agencies implement, have direct bearing on economic development within the state. And all state environmental agencies recognize that. And we strive very hard to make sure that we are not impeding economic development simply because we're either inefficient or because we do not have adequate capacity to implement our programs. As states, we've done a lot to try to increase efficiency, streamlining processes, minimizing time that it takes for a lot of our activities. But as I mentioned, the gap of capacity and what the demands are still continues to widen. So there's good news. It's a relatively simple problem to address, and it really does come down to funding. So would like to just, ECOS has actually a very specific request, so we're not just simply saying, hey, it's a problem, give us more funding. As we've looked at the history of our categorical grant funding, we are asking for some help with the inflationary costs that we've seen over the last 10 years. And so we have a specific request for FY25, and it's based on the FY 2010 funding adjusted for a very modest 1.4% inflationary factor. So it would result in about an $80 million increase in categorical grant funding. In addition to that, since my SRF Bureau Chief is in the audience right now, would also just like to reiterate, we have a lot of concerns with the SRF program and the fact that, funding is not adequate to keep up with the demand. The inflation or bipartisan infrastructure law did a lot to kind of help, but unfortunately it hasn't had the effect that I think everyone was hoping for, because a lot of money's been taken off the traditional SRF program. So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Start there as a conversation.
Okay, sorry, I forgot we finished. Okay, we'll move on to our panel. I have my colleague from Michigan, Karen. This is a representative of Governor of Michigan as the Deputy Director of Federal Affairs. I want to talk to you. I know y'all doing some innovative work on PFAS mitigation, coming up with some state solutions to go tackle the problems. I think it's a strike force group or something otherwise. And then if you could share a little bit what you're doing to mitigate the problem, and also y'all's thoughts on this new role.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to dig in. Again, I sit here in the Governor's DC office, work closely with our in-state folks in Michigan. Following in Jordan's footsteps, I'll also remind everyone Michigan is home to the National College Football Champions.
Oh.
So we have a table of winners up here. But as Jordan did mention, the NGA does have a priority of just working on PFAS in general. It's a pretty umbrella priority, in part because states handle it differently. So a lot of what I'll be talking about today is what we're doing in Michigan and kind of some of the cutting edge ways we're taking a look at things. We actually started sampling PFAS back in 2018, and we formed what's called MPART, which is the Michigan PFAS Action Response Team. It was formed under an executive order at first, but then it became a permanent body under another executive order in 2019. And really the goal of this body is to protect public health by identifying sources of PFAS, to address PFAS contamination at the source, and working with local health departments to protect people in areas where groundwater is impacted by PFAS. So it's unique in that it incorporates agencies across the state, including our Department of Agriculture, Health and Human Services, Energy and Environment, DNR, MDOT, also licensing and regulatory affairs, and of course our National Guard. So really, it really reminds everyone how much does touch PFAS. But in addition to having this separate body work on these issues as they come up to make sure that we have consistent messaging across the state, they're also informed by a citizens advisory group. There's also a science advisory group and local health department advisory council, really recognizing that it takes all voices while we all grapple with this new science, while we all try to figure out what national standards exist. And I'm happy to report that by the end of FY23, MPART's identified 266 PFAS sites. We have a helpful interactive map online too, where people can find across the state of Michigan where there's PFAS contamination found in groundwater. And we don't just work to identify it, we then work with local public health departments, not only on mitigation and cleanup, but also very importantly, speaking to the public about it and making sure folks are informed. In Michigan, we have state level standards for both, we have MCLs for both drinking and groundwater. And so pivoting a little bit to what Jordan was asking about in terms of the MCLs today, we're certainly welcoming them. We put out a favorable statement in some of the EPA releases from our Department of Environment and Energy and Great Lakes. You know, we're really glad to see that that across the nation, folks are really going to be prioritizing this important issue. We're going to have to see how it impacts the state. There were a couple of compounds that, you know, we didn't expect to be included, and now they will be included, so we're going to have to see what those costs will look like and how the primacy will work out moving forward. But it'll take some time. There's some regs that are above Michigan standards, some that are below. So we're going to be working through that as we move forward. But frankly, we have a leg up in this process in that we've been working on it for some time, and also recognize that that's not the case for all states. And so I would just like to put in a plug. One of the things that we've been advocating for the federal government, if you're looking for creative solutions around PFAS, is to consider something like what we've done in Michigan, but at the federal level. We've presented to some interagency work groups on what we've done within the state, and suggesting maybe there be a federal, more formal body that gathers folks around PFAS. There are a lot of interagency task forces. Those tend to be a bit ad hoc and kind of come together as needed, but authority isn't very clear. So we recommend kind of a strategic roadmap, a coordination system at the federal level. Feeling free to encourage the feds to learn from what we've been doing in Michigan. So I'll stop there and happy to answer questions later.
Thanks so much.
Well, thank you, and you're pointing to the need for that additional federal support is important. Next, we're going to go to Leah Feldon, who's the director of the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. And Leah, one of the challenges that a lot of state agencies have been facing is that we have been underfunded for decades. Jess was mentioning the categorical grants have remained stagnant. Can you talk about the impact on the workforce, what the implications of workforce challenges are for state agencies, and perhaps what you've seen in your state particularly?
Yes, thank you, Secretary Beiser. So, hello everyone. As Elizabeth said, my name is Leah Feldon, and I'm with Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. It's really nice to be here with all of you today talking about these important issues. At the risk of my credibility, I have nothing to tell you about sports. Except for those of you who aren't very much into sports, I'll share with you a term that a friend of mine uses to show her lack of knowledge in sports. She refers to them all as sports ball. So if you ever need to use that, there you go. So yeah, I think as Jess talked about, and as we've all been talking about, state agencies across the country have been underfunded for many years, really, and the federal grants are not significantly changing over the last 20 years or so. I think the statistic right now is that state budgets, only about 27% on average is federal funding for state budgets. And this really varies, though, by state. I can tell you in Oregon, federal funding makes up 10% of our budget. And so that's just a really large gap to fill over time, obviously. And, with different state revenues and legislatures, then it's hard to fill that gap with general fund. And a large percentage of state budget, certainly for Oregon, is fee funds. And that's, really challenging for the business community as well to keep raising those fees. But that's what happens if we're trying to keep our same staff in our workforce. If the federal funding goes down over time, which it effectively does because it's not increased for inflation, we have to fill those gaps with fees and with general fund, which of course everybody's competing for that general fund. The other thing that's happening over time, of course, is that we have more and new programs. There's emerging contaminants, there's increased regulatory complexity. I would say especially in the air program, we've noticed that. And a lot of the fees are directly related to the amount that you pollute, in particular in the federal program. So if our goal is to reduce the amount of pollution, the amount of toxics, the amount of those criteria pollutants, and to make figure out more sustainable ways for businesses to operate, that also decreases the amount that they're paying. So this is a system that we need to work on. I think, as Elizabeth was asking about workforce, finding and keeping knowledgeable staff is a real challenge. And I think that as long as staff see that the funding isn't necessarily stable, that's going to be a factor for them in terms of whether they stay at a state agency versus looking around to other opportunities. And certainly in Oregon, that's an issue when we are headquartered in the city of Portland, and the city has a lot of attractive jobs as well. Just a bit on air in particular and waste programs. As you heard from Jess, under the Clean Air Act, state and local agencies really are the front line for almost all the states in implementing the federal clean air programs. And many states have new programs that they have implemented at the state level, and the state needs to fund those. But a lot of times, just that core funding for the Title V, which is the federal permitting program, has not increased, and it's really a challenge to keep those staff that are very knowledgeable in those areas. Air agencies are responsible for monitoring and data analysis, permit issuance, inspections, complaint response, emission reduction strategies, the whole gamut of what the public expects from an air program. Additionally, there's a lot more public outreach, involvement, and education that's necessary these days. There's a lot more monitoring happening at a citizen level, and so we need to work with our partners and citizens that are concerned about what's going on in their airshed. Just as an example of the ongoing work that's really needed at the state level, there was an EPA report that noted regarding air emissions that in terms of the 6 principal air pollutants, that those have actually dropped by 73% in the last 40 years. Great news. However, approximately 85 million people nationwide still live in counties with pollution levels that are above the standards that are acceptable for public health. So good news, more work to do. And then just briefly, in terms of waste programs, I would just note one of ECOS's sister associations, the Association of State and Territorial Solid Waste Management Officials, ATSWAMO, for those who know that organization. They had a 2023 report that while states are generally required to provide a 25% match, this is just in waste programs, ATSWAMO estimates that states are actually providing about 48% of program costs, and the grant funding has fallen short $63 million in terms of total costs to run the program. And additionally, similar to, I think, the AIR programs, states are undertaking maybe fewer, but certainly more complex rulemakings that take considerable resources and increased data management activities. Elizabeth mentioned, considering the sustainable management of waste, right? We've certainly evolved. It's not just about how do you get rid of it, it's the whole life cycle that we really need to look at. So, thanks for the question, Elizabeth. I think overall the increased workload with stagnant funding is it's a real challenge for states across the board.
Thank you, Leah, and I'll acknowledge we've got ATSWAMO here, so I appreciate their partnership as well.
Thank you so much. Our next question will focus specifically on the congressional staffers here. Just out of curiosity, do you mind raising your hand if you work in Congress? Excellent. So this conversation will be on my counterpart, Jim McCleskey, focusing on the impact of CDS on state revolving funds. And just to be very clear, we're not against congressionally directed spending, but we just want to serve this opportunity to educate all the congressional staff on the impacts of taking funding from that account on the long-term viability of these state revolving funds. My counterpart, Jim McCleskey, he's the Dean of the Hall of States in 2019 when I started working for the governor. My first
You're doing
meeting...
math in your head, I'll know it.
I think it's 4 governors, 5 governors, I can't keep count anymore. My first meeting was with Jim McCleskey when I started for the Governor McMaster in 2019, and I think I had a 2-hour conversation about the education reform bill of the 1990s. So we can't have a 45-minute to an hour conversation here. I think you got 5 minutes, but Jim, you framed the problem very well, and I think 3 to 4 buckets of this impact on states through this congressionally directed spending.
Thank you. And the reason we talked so long about the education bill of 20 years ago when we first met was the states, we're all about, over in the Hall of States, over on the other side of the hill, finding the things that we agree on that really aren't partisan. They do come down to federalism. They certainly come down to federal-state partnerships. That was why I got into that long diatribe. I'll try not to go too deep down the rabbit hole today. I touched on some of these broad themes. I want to reference a couple of things to you all, and they are in your package. A letter from last September to the appropriations leadership that was signed by the states on the state drinking water fund issues, the SRF issues. I think that did a good job of sort of summarizing, but I call this the quadruple whammy. And I did touch on this in my opener, but I'm going to just run through the 4 pieces of the quadruple whammy. And I've recently been advised there may be a quintuple, which I'll circle back on. What I'll start with, and I think all of you have some familiarity with this, I mentioned that I kind of got my start with SRFs a long time ago. This is a model that works, right? Every community anywhere will take grant money over loan money. Let's stipulate that. I would too, right? But a revolving loan fund at lower than market interest that then functions on a continuous basis, that makes a lot of sense for states who are delegated the authority and the requirement to work with our local partners to meet the requirements of the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act, right? So SRFs make a lot of sense. But, my senator served on the Environment and Public Works Committee, not on appropriations. And, where you stand is where you sit. So, it makes total sense to me that any member office who gets asked by a local community in their district or in their state for some help, they're going to try to respond if the means is there to respond and if they want to engage in directed spending. And I understand different members take different views on that, and that's fine. We have, as I said, a subset of ours play and a subset of ours don't. But we are undercutting the SRFs. The SRFs aren't functioning properly right now. And the tables that you've got in your package help to make that point. It's masked to a degree right now due to the IIJA, But that's, I think we're all treating that as kind of once in a generation temporary money. We'll see what you all decide a couple of years from now. But in terms of what's appropriated to capitalize these revolving loan funds, we are not in a good place, and we really need your help. The quadruple whammy is that off the top earmarks are provided to local recipients as grants, not loans, which simultaneously undercuts formula allocations, 1, any return to the SRF to sustain future availability, 2, and administrative funding for state staff to run the program, as we've just talked about in several instances. And to top it off, a handful of states with well-positioned appropriators actually now do better on a total dollar basis, while most other states do substantially worse. Those are the quadruple. The quintuple is, and I was looking for this as I was sitting here, and I haven't quite found it yet. It was said to me recently by our water infrastructure team in town last week that there's language in the recent appropriations bill to actually direct that a higher percentage of SRF transactions be grants, not loans. I haven't put eyeballs on that yet, Ben. You may be able to verify. That would be the quintuple, is now not only taking funds off the top, which does the 4 whammies, but we're going to direct that more money be granted. Again, if I'm a community, I'd rather have a grant than a loan. But as I said before, communities that can afford to go hire a consultant or a lobbyist to come to the Hill and get an earmark that isn't prioritized through any comparison compared to what, right? We're talking about highest and best use of limited resources. And we need your help. I will say, on the transportation side of life, the THUD subcommittees have set rules whereby member-directed spending has to be for projects that are in the STIP, the Strategic Transportation Investment Plan, which all states have, that can be spent in the early years, right? So already racked and stacked, already prioritized. That makes a lot of sense. There are somewhat similar provisions in the environment and what do we call it, Water and Environment Subcommittee that requires that projects be eligible under a state program, but doesn't require that they be prioritized and spendable in the early years. So basically, you can go and run a racked and stacked system. I work for Congress, right? Maybe not an appropriator. I believe in Article 1 powers of the purse. So we're not here to argue against earmarks. But making them additive rather than off the top would help a lot on several of these issues that are right now making the SRF unworkable and really undercutting what it's supposed to be. So thanks for listening.
Thank you, Jim. Next, we're going to turn to Serena McElwain, who's the Secretary of the Maryland Department of Environment. Whenever folks think about state regulatory agencies, state environmental agencies, the first thing that comes to mind is permitting. And so I know permitting these days is a lot more complex. We are seeing a lot of issues dealing with making sure we've got community involvement. There's environmental justice. There's efforts to streamline permits. So could you talk about some of your efforts in Maryland on those issues?
Yes. Hello, everyone. I'll be happy to. And I know I only have 2 minutes, so I'm going to go really fast and cover a lot of things. So for permitting for the Maryland's Department of the Environment, it is really one of my top priorities, and really there are three reasons why. One reason why it's a real high priority is because it can stimulate the economy, right? When we start getting permits to be more automated, move faster, quicker. Right now in my agency, they're not really automated. There's been some attempts to do it, but it's not automated. So that's one of the priorities, to really streamline and get the permits done faster. And the second reason, really one of the more important reasons is it just literally just takes too long. Some permits are 3 years to get it done, and I just don't understand that. And there's a lot of people who have a piece of that process that are really unnecessary. So we're trying to clean it, lean it, get it better so that businesses can get what they need faster. That's going to help with the economy in Maryland. My Governor Westmore, he wants to bring in more businesses in Maryland, and the only way to do that is to fix the permitting process. The third reason why it's important is the environmental justice community. Right now, the EJ community and disadvantaged, other lower income communities are not a part of the process. So what we'd like to do is bring them in to be a part of the process. And that's what I'm working on really as a real top priority, is bringing them to the process, particularly for some of those permits that have long been an issue in those communities, and those permits are now coming up for renewal. Takes 5 years. So we're expanding, we're doing more with communities, we're engaging more, and that's really most of the reasons why I have really elevated permitting to one of the top priorities in Maryland.
Thank you, Serena.
Yes.
Next, we're going to go to Emma Pocon, who's a commissioner of the Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation. And so, Emma, I want to circle back. Obviously, the SRFs are a very big issue for us. We've seen historic federal investment. Can you talk about, from especially Alaska's perspective, what you're seeing both short-term with that investment, but also long-term with the concern about eroding the corpus of that funding, and what the impacts could be for a state like yours?
Thanks, Elizabeth. So for the SRF, I think there's been a mindfulness to having supplemental appropriations for SRF to sort of cover that short term, and I think the IIJA funding has been really helpful for a lot of states. In Alaska, for infrastructure needs there, we have communities that still don't have running water. And they're rural communities. They're not affluent communities that are hiring lobbyists to come to DC. These are small rural communities off of the road system that don't have running water. There's a very real, very neat, concrete need for investment for those communities from a health perspective. We also have the last 301H waiver communities in the state. Those are community wastewater facilities that don't have the same treatment technologies as everybody else. And so in order to be protective of water quality standards, there needs to be some additional investment in those community systems to ensure that the waterways are safe and that the uses of those waterways can be maintained. There is a concern, I think, longer term, looking at the set aside from the SRF funding for support for our regulatory programs, for our drinking water program, right? Like, these are the people that on a day-to-day basis are helping our communities throughout the state ensure that the drinking water is safe for our residents. This is important work. This is life-saving work. And having that set aside, potentially eroded, or looking off into the future, I think 2027 is kind of the year that we have our eye on, to ensure that the funding is there for those regulatory programs so that they can continue doing that work. And on that front about funding for regulatory programs, Leah spoke a little bit to the Clean Air Act and the RCRA programs and the Clean Water Act programs, but on the point about the categorical grants, I think I guess if I could leave you all with one message today, it is federal programs should be federally funded. We, as the states, are implementing those programs as Congress intended, where there's an opportunity for the states to step forward and take on primary implementation. But not having an increase in the federal funding support for that in such a long time is really produces less effective programs, and frankly, it's unfair. I'll give you the example of our 402 program for Alaska when we took on primacy of that program, and we went to our legislature to seek that authority in 2005. We thought, and we estimated for our legislature, that we were talking about a $1.5 million investment in the state. Today, state funding for that program is over $5 million. And the federal funding that is available for that is around 1.4. Now, it's available for our 402 program, but we also have other things that we implement under the Clean Water Act that we use that funding for. I realize that for a lot of people in the room, that sounds like maybe not a lot of money, but maybe that's the point, right? Like, this is a modest investment for a really big impact for water quality in every state, and also ensuring that the permitting can get done, and the permitting can get done in a timely fashion so that we can have economic development, so that we can have those facilities up and running and creating jobs in our communities. So I guess on both of those points, I think both for our drinking water program and the SRF set-asides, we want to ensure that we have long-term stable funding for those programs. And for our other delegated or assumed federal primacy programs, that we have an appropriate level of federal support for those programs, because they are programs that are implemented under federal law.
Thank you, Emma.
Thank you so much, and that concludes our roundtable. I will ask each panelist to give some closing remarks on how Congress could support our agencies and our governors in strengthening public environmental programs and water infrastructure. I know we've talked about PFAS, state revolving fund, workforce, and permitting, and to your point, states have invested money. We just recently appropriated $10 million in state funds to do testing and monitoring on PFAS. We do appreciate Congress's efforts to pass the infrastructure bill, as well as CARES and ARPA. Like I said, ARPA provided $1.4 billion for water sewer. We've used $400 million of ARPA for broadband connectivity, so we have been utilizing these resources, but the unmet need is still out there. And I'll start real quick, and I'll get back to SRF. If you're a congressional staffer and your boss does do appropriation requests, congressional and directed spending, if we don't solve this problem today, I do encourage you to work with your governor's office on selecting the projects y'all would like to fund out of state revolving funds. There's no prioritization system. As Jim mentioned, you don't have to be on the STIP, but at least consult your environmental agency, consult your governor on which projects you're looking at sending to the Appropriations Committee to ensure that you know that this project is going to be a well-funded project and is actually there's a need there. So that's where I sit, and I'll pass it to you.
Great. Well, before I go further, and I've got Jim walking out here, but is there anything that Texas or DC or New Mexico would like to share as any closing thoughts from you all?
No, I just echo the remarks that you made. I think it affects Texas as well. Things are in the airspace, new national ambient air quality standards. There is a great reduction in pollutants, but the standards keep getting lower as well. So even though we've made a lot of progress, there's still a lot more work to be done there.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jim. I think just to echo that, some high-level takeaways here is that the states are engaged in cooperative federalism. We are the folks who are carrying out a lot of federal programs, Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act being the two of the biggest, but we are the boots on the ground that are actually carrying out these directives. And when we have new standards, new issues coming forward, new complexities, we are taking all of those on without additional funding, and that funding has actually decreased because it has remained stagnant while we've faced issues like inflation, having to pay legislative pay increases from within existing amounts. So those categorical grants, you may not hear about them from a lot of folks, but you're going to hear about them from us because they are very critical for us meeting workforce needs, making sure that we're meeting the needs of our communities to get permitting done in a timely, efficient manner, and to make sure that we're carrying out our mission to protect public health and the environment. We also, you've heard a lot today about the SRFs. That is a critical issue. Aging infrastructure and PFAS would be my two takeaways there, but we are facing a cliff. Right now, I would argue that has been supplanting. The IIJA has been supplanting what's been traditionally given through the SRF system versus supplementing it. So instead of being a big shot in the arm to really help move infrastructure forward in the country, it's actually just replaced what a lot of states have come to rely on through their SRF program. So in order for that investment to have the necessary or the intended impact, we need to make sure that we're protecting that underlying program. Again, agnostic on congressionally directed spending, we're just asking that not be taken out of the base of the program. And then lastly, I'll just mention on PFAS, because everything, a lot of issues come back to that, making sure states have the necessary resources that we need to help our water systems come into compliance, but also make sure that we're identifying sources and that we're getting to the bottom of it so that we are removing PFAS from the environment, destroying it effectively. And there's a whole host of issues we could get into. We could have a whole briefing, I think, just on that topic alone. But making sure that we've got those resources to move forward and address them in our communities is going to be critical. Any of my other colleagues have any closing thoughts?
I think we were wanting questions potentially,
Yeah.
so.
Yeah, I thank you all. I would turn to you, particularly to congressional staff and House staff. If you have any questions for our distinguished panel, that would be great.
Solutions on state revolving fund.
Well, I do have a question about the SRFs. At what point?
Tell the folks who you're with.
Oh, hi, everybody. I'm Peter Biava. I work in strategy and business development with Meridium. We are an infrastructure investor and developer. my question is about the SRFs. At what point is the forgiveness of the loan decided, and is there any visibility on whether or not a project applying for SRFs will more likely than not require that forgiveness? And the reason I'm asking is because there might be a different alignment on how those funds are requested depending on how much forgiveness you need.
I'm not gonna be the expert on
Boy, that's
drawing that line.
kind of in the weeds a little bit.
It's
Yeah.
usually a needs, it's a
Mhm. Yeah.
needs-based approach. I know for us, I don't know if that's how we're supposed to do it, but for us, it's a need-based. So a lot of times when we give SRF funding and disadvantage, communities and counties, they're the ones who are most likely going to get those loans forgiven.
I think
So
it
that's
may
just-
vary based on state
Mhm.
too.
Yeah.
So,
Oh, and that's Maryland, so.
yeah, I think that's.
Disadvantaged communities are defined
Disadva-
differently.
yeah.
I mean, there is
Well, that's true.
EPA guidance on the programs, but there is a recognition that particularly during COVID and the economic recession, that loans weren't gonna cut it at all. But what you're hearing from the states is that you need to have both. A situation where there is principal subsidy or negative interest loans, but the beauty of the revolving funds is very important, and giving states the ability to provide grants on an as needs basis through the SRF programs is really important.
Because there is a combination. Sometimes it's SRS, it's also grants. I had a county coming to me just recently. They had a lot of money. We gave them a lot of money, SRF money, and grants, and there was a gap. And they were wondering, well, where am I gonna get that money from? You need to give me that too. And we couldn't. But there was a loan program they could have gotten in. We don't want a loan. We want the money. So sometimes we're trying to help, but it's difficult to get 100% for these projects. So anyway, yeah.
We have
various sources.
And one program we have is a viable utility reserve program. So for the neediest communities, or the communities that a grant might just be a Band-Aid, it's a more comprehensive program that does provide grants, but also has education components, rate studies, inventory, asset inventories, planning for the future. So I think just every state's going to treat that a little bit differently, but overall.
Yeah. Great, thanks. Other questions? Elizabeth, I'm looking at you.
I'm Elizabeth from the Environment and Public Works Committee. Really, I think one of the things we're wrestling with is the permitting issue at the federal level too. And you talked about how a lot of the requirements that you all are implementing are actually federal requirements that then you're kind of trying to tailor to your local community. So, Secretary McGowan, is there anything we can do at the federal level to sort of assist some of I like the clean and lean term you use, anything we can do to kind of help with that, or information sharing? Because you're all operating in these separate buckets, but you're all implementing the same programs and issuing the same permits at the end of the day. So what can we do to kind of assist or facilitate that?
Yeah, you make a good point. So we have states who are trying to clean and lean, right, the permitting process, but we also have to rely on US EPA to do the same thing. Because again, we all have permits, and sometimes we're going through US EPA, or constituents they're coming through us. So in my mind, to have a system where we can all talk and see what's going on will really help in the overall permitting process. So it's one thing for me to fix mine and yours is broken. And so it's just that silos that I think we have as a union. Federal and state, there's a silos, and if we could break it and do it together, I think that's going to make it even more faster to get things done.
I just wanted to add one of the additional examples where the National Governors Association and ECOS are working together is on permitting for infrastructure. Infrastructure group and NGA is having regional workshops. ECOS is planning to do the same. In order to achieve clean energy ambition or environmental ambition, you need to make sure that there are more effective and efficient permitting processes to put into place the infrastructure that needs to get permitted. So that's not just about money, that's about greater coordination between the Federal Permitting Council and making sure states are involved in that and involved in the permitting efficiencies at the state level too, because it takes both sides to be working together with communities. Other comments or not?
I would add to that. You know, I think we all are and are, I guess, continuously looking for efficiencies, right? But at the end of the day, sometimes it just comes down to having the resources to do the work. And yeah, we'll dig and we'll look in those couch cushions for the efficiencies, but you know, just having the money to have the staff to get the work done so that we have good, credible, well-supported, legally defensible permits. It takes time, it takes expertise, it takes resource, right? So I'm absolutely in support of efficiencies and finding those, but I can share a story from our air program, right? So we have our air permitting group, and they're cranking out permits, making sure facilities have good, solid standards, and they've, you know, justified and provided all the support that they need to say that they can meet the standards. But then I've got a bunch of SIP work coming from EPA saying you've got to do a new state implementation plan for this, that, or the other thing, right? For RPM 2.5 non-attainment area, for regional haze, for a variety of other things. And so, you know, we're trying to meet federal deadlines for those SIP submissions. And, you know, so we'll pull resources from where we can in a division of 70 people. It's pretty small, right, to do the work for the entire state. And sometimes that means taking a couple permitters and having them support the SIP submission so we can get it in by the federal deadline. But that means that we've taken resources away from the permitting. So we're shifting resources around, trying to find creative ways to get the work done on the deadlines that are demanded. But we've now invested more state money in our air division because, you know, that was sort of eroding our ability to get permits out in a timely way. Efficiency is great, we are all always looking for it, but at the end of the day, those categorical grants are so critical for us. If we don't have the federal support for the federal programs, you know, sometimes the impossible is the impossible.
Jess, Idaho.
Yeah, I'd just like to add, you know, I would argue that states really are pretty efficient and proficient at issuing permits. We really, where the, you know, challenges come is if there is a federal nexus. A lot of times if EPA for like an air quality permit, if it's a potential for significant deterioration, EPA is more interested in it, and that can certainly slow it down. So having clearer guidelines as to what type of projects and when they might be interested, so that at the 11th hour they aren't, you know, interjecting themselves in a process where it would have been helpful to have them in earlier, I think could be very helpful. But at the end of the day, as far as the state's processes go, it really does come down to resources. I mean, we have some large projects in Idaho that those projects are on their 5th permit rider. Just because of the turnover that we've had, and that slows it down, and you can't Kaizen that process. It really slows it down as you're getting a new person on and trying to, you know, pick up where that last permit rider left off. We have about 60% of our employees have been in their position 3 years or less. And that all is coming down to resources and them choosing to go to other organizations, including EPA, for additional funding. So it's a frustration on the part of the states where we're doing the bulk of the work, we don't have the resources to do it, and in my mind it's a pretty simple solution.
Everybody wants clean air, everybody wants clean water. We're the ones doing that work, and we're doing it under the purview of federal standards and federal oversight. Federal government should be paying for it.
I want to encourage participants to ask questions of the panelists. We'll mill around for a little bit, but we're pretty much out of time. I also, was there one last question?
Yeah, I was going to ask a question. I'm Alex with American Chemistry Council, and you bring up a great point about 60% of your workforce is new. The other states, is that echoed in your states? Is it similar numbers of new? I know it's pretty young in South Carolina.
Yeah, absolutely. Our environmental director couldn't be here today because she was actually at Winthrop College trying to do a job fair. And so we are literally getting kids out of college and providing them like incentives to get into state government. We're seeing that all the time, and that institutional knowledge is just depleting. People are aging out of state government, and it's incredibly difficult to get folks to go into state government at this time.
I'll say from North Carolina's perspective, a third of our workforce can retire in the next 3 to 4 years. And with that is a lot of the institutional knowledge that goes along with that. And so experienced permit engineers, as Jess was saying, can turn out a lot more permits in the same amount of time than somebody who's brand new.
Is that what a Paisan is?
Kaizen.
But one other point I want to make on that side is that we're not the only ones experiencing a lot of turnover. We're seeing that workforce wide, but that also results in us getting applications in, to your point about the permitting process. The other challenge we have is getting bad applications in that don't have the information they need, and so we end up training folks who are coming to us because they're sending junior engineers to work on applications. And so it's not just on our side that we've got a lot of turnover. There's also a lot of turnover on the private industry side, and so the quality of application, we encourage folks, if you submit a quality application, the process goes much faster. And so that is a variable that we're unable to control. And we used to do a lot of education and outreach when we had more capacity. But we're so stretched thin that we don't have that ability to do that proactive outreach to the community that's applying for the permits to start with.
Okay. Hey, a round of applause for the panel.
Good job.